Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Welcome to the Wesley Theatre here. We have read for us as part of our worship the Transfiguration passage from Luke's Gospel. What I want to do is read the few verses that follow that narrative in Luke's Gospel. The next day, putting a link to what has gone before, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he's my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." "You unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion, but Jesus rebuked the evil spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. According to Luke's Gospel, the Transfiguration, as we know it, this passage that is so different than almost anything we read anywhere else in the New Testament, occurs 8 days after Jesus called the disciples to follow him, to count the cost of discipleship. It's important to note that it's found in the context of prayer. Because of that, and because of the going to sleep, some have decided in their minds it must have happened at night. And if it says the next day in the passage that follows, there might be some consistency in that argument. Whatever it is profoundly spiritual in nature. And by that I mean not that it is merely devotional, but that it brings us close to Jesus Christ in a way that merely stories and accounts about him or stories he told often don't. The Lord takes this inner circle of disciples. There are a number of groupings. There are the 120 that are there at Pentecost. There are the 12, and there are the three. The three that he takes up the mountainside. And as they are there on the mountain, his face changed. We read the appearance of his face changed. And the glory of Jesus Christ shines through, illuminating, highlighting something deep and profound to these disciples. Perhaps it was a willingness on his part to only share it with that other group of disciples. I don't think that's the only point there, but the key word is metamorpho. The word for which we develop into metamorphosis. It is transformation. It is change. It is simply changed. Something about him was different. Jesus and this small inner circle climbed the mountain, and in doing so offer a challenge to each one of us. We're called individually and as a community of faith at the beginning of the year, conscious that we reflect upon Jesus and the way he handled that inner group of disciples and reveals something of his glory to them. Now, climbing the mountain doesn't mean to say that we're all called to be Bear Grylls during this year, though I have to say his Christian discipleship in Britain is known immensely as one of great integrity. But we'll give up the Bear Grylls climbing. But the challenge is that we all have summits and we all have places. In our areas of work, we could delineate them, we could explore them and say, these are the challenges that lie before us in the present year. Wesley Mission, as 2016 begins to open up before us, we recognize the changing political, social, and religious culture. What does an account like this in the gospel say to us at the beginning of a new year? It would seem to me that the transfiguration of Jesus bears witness to his greater redemptive mission. Put rather more simply, in the face of suffering, rejection, and even death, Jesus remains resolute as he moves to that cross. And yet, in the process of moving to that cross, to face the very worst that could be, we are given a vision of something of his glory. If we were sitting in smaller groups, and in effect we do that week by week, representing the range of activities for which we have responsibility, we could helpfully explore some of the possible obstacles to the achievements of the objectives or the summits that we ourselves know are there. Bishop William Willimon tells the endearing story of a friend who was a minister in the African American church. His friend shared with him something of the protracted journey, the cruel journey to obtaining what were described as civil rights. He commented it didn't just happen overnight, and how it took so long for the concern of activity for white liberals to join the campaign. Some high-minded and sensitive activists came from the north to Mississippi. And when you get to Mississippi and some of those southern states, you know that's where they felt some of the worst of this. And they arrived there and were perplexed at the approach being taken by the black church. The first thing Martin Luther King did, and his cohorts did, when they were about to do any activities, they gathered together in some small, often insignificant black Baptist church. And they sang, and they prayed, and they sang a bit more. And then they went about what they were doing. And there were many very high-minded white liberals who said, well, that's very fine, this sort of thing, but what use is it? What's this, all this interminable preaching and praying got to do with the actual gaining of real rights? Willimon records the words of his friend. You see, we black folks have been doing this thing longer than you have, you white people. We know that 200 years of evil is not going to be eradicated with a march to Jackson. And in it, I think is something profound about the reality that what we are engaged in, when it is not just compassion, it is about justice. It's not going to happen overnight. But we're engaged in a much larger story. And it was the preaching and the prayers that maintained, that inspired, that kept people going even when they felt like giving up. One of my summer films this year was Suffragette. It's not often you go to the cinema and there's an ovation at the end of the film. But there was, as we went. We found it very moving. The examples of New Zealand, Australia on women's suffrage, of course, are well told and earlier than Britain. But gosh, you didn't have the stuffiness of Westminster to deal with. And that was the battle for the women in those places in Hackney and Lambeth and the inner parts of London, where poverty was very real and the rights of women given no place. There could be countless examples of the summits that people have had to climb to achieve what they know is right. We are part of that story that is real. And this passage of transfiguration comes before we enter Lent. It's actually reflected on through the season as well. And it speaks of withdrawal and return. And I like that about it. That if we're going to make a difference, there are often times that we have to withdraw. That we have to put in perspective, that we have to have a spiritual dynamic to be able to engage in that which is real. And the inner dynamic of the Christian life, and therefore highly appropriate as we begin in our worship, is that the disciples climbed a high mountain. It's how mountains are important. Wasn't it on the mountain that the law was given? Wasn't it time and time again on mountains that were important? Wasn't it on a mountain that Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel? But as they climbed this mountain, how could they ever have imagined the experience that was going to be theirs, that you read about in 1 Peter, that talks about something that radically changed their lives? Mountaintop experiences are words that we do understand. And this occurs on the way to the cross. The Gospels don't give us all the details of Jesus' ministry, but what we do know is that the pace quickens from this point on. From this point on, coming down from the mountain, there is no time for messing about. There is no time for a quick latte. They have to be about and engaged now. The business that will separate those who are serious about the gospel and those who are not. The spirituality we observe in the Transfiguration is not escape from reality, though I understand why we might feel that. Clouds enveloping and an experience that is so very different may make us feel that, but it is a return to what has to be, which is why that passage is so important. The struggling to do the ordinary that was true of the disciples, and Jesus being very sharp with those disciples. Consider the relationship between our Christian discipleship and our missional purpose. What word and deed means in the deepest and profound sense. Not saying prayers alone and doing good, but engaging in the issues of justice and service intertwined with a meaningful missiology and spirituality. Moses and Elijah appear in the vision. They represent the law and the prophets, the cloud of God's presence. The dangers of seeking the summit have been all too vividly demonstrated in many stories. I think also of the story of Henry Worsley in his journey across Antarctica in recent days, which ended in tragedy. In early May 1996, 31 climbers on Mount Everest were suddenly trapped by a ferocious storm. 8 of them lost their lives, the highest number actually to have lost their lives at any one time. In Patrick Meyer's play K2, a maroon climber on the Himalayan peak gives the play its name and voices this line: "Mountains are metaphors." And mountains are metaphors for all the challenges we have to do. We have to climb our mountains. We have to face our mountains. And as we do, so we will see something of God's fulfillment. Mountains are metaphors for testing, for seeking, and most significant of all, for vision. Jesus took Peter, James, and John on a trek up that mountainside. Seeking the summit would mean maybe death for many people. If we would go with Jesus to the summit, if we would reach for the summit of whatever it is that God is calling for Wesley Mission, there will be a cost about it. We read the words of Jesus in the earlier verses: "For those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for my sake will save it." And despite the summit signifying a quest, we recognize that it involves many risks. It involves many things that life presents to us. It's told by Matthew, Mark, and Luke with almost an equal amount of detail. It's that important in the gospel narrative. It's amazing, really, how many focus upon passages, and you say, what's in all of them? And in all the synoptic gospels, this transfiguration narrative that is hard to preach, difficult to read, sometimes impossible to come to terms with, is in them all. So put simply, you better take it seriously. It's important in understanding the ministry of Jesus. What does it have to say to us? Well, first of all, transformative power has a spiritual focus. Jesus is facing a crucial decision. If we take a serious analysis of the humanity of Jesus, he must be asking questions about direction, wondering which way am I now to turn. It wouldn't surprise us that Jesus chooses to pray, but how often is prayer the last thing rather than the first thing? In a recent pastoral context, I heard someone say something like this: well, at least I can pray, can't I? I felt like saying, gosh, no. Not at least you can pray. Praying is the first place in which we place all the other practical and important aspects. Not the at least, but the first. And that's how it was for Jesus. One writer described prayer as an invitation home. He placed prayer as a different approach to the noise, hurry and crowds, the push and shove, the frustration, the fear, the intimidation of life. Richard Foster continues, we don't need to be shy. He invites us into the living room of his heart where we can put the old slippers on and share freely. He invites us into the kitchen of his friendship, where we chatter and we mix batter and have conversation. He invites us into the dining room where his strength is to be found and where we can feast to our heart's delight. He invites us into the study where his wisdom will help us to learn, grow, stretch and ask all the questions we want. He invites us into the workshop of his creativity where we can be co-laborers with him. He invites us into the bedroom of his rest where we find new peace and new life and we can be vulnerable and free. It's only when we understand spiritual transformation is part of what it means to respond to the challenge and climb the summit. At Caesarea Philippi, Jesus announced to a small group of disciples that they would be going to Jerusalem and that he would offer up his life as he is rejected. Peter was swift to protest. It's recorded in Matthew, "Never, Lord, we'll never let this happen to you." But Jesus interrupted him. That's how the meeting ended. And so that's when the text says, 8 days later. What happened in that 8 days? Come on, I want to know. What were the meals like? What were the conversations like? What was it like as they walked along? Was it quiet? Did he say very little to them? Was he reflecting very much how he could get through to these disciples that clearly were missing the mark? As we encounter such moments, they impact our lives. You see, visions come to people who are awake. The Transfiguration, like so many difficult passages, has multiple levels of meaning. The fact that the disciples are asleep has something to say to me. Remember, they're asleep on another occasion too, nearer to the Passion. We may say to ourselves, how did they manage to fall asleep? Oh, but it happens to you, doesn't it? You go home, and you turn that thing on that's in the model in the corner of one of your room, but I think now mainly covering one of the walls, in fact, in the room, and you turn it on, and it's that program that you really need to see. And you fall asleep. Now, if it doesn't ever happen to you, I am prepared to confess it has happened to me. But modern technology allows us now, we can slip it back and catch the few minutes that helped us to nod off. But sleeping at critical moments is not just an experience for the disciples here. It really speaks, I think, into missing the mark, not really grasping whatever it is that God is wanting to say to us, from us, and through us. With their head in the clouds, they drifted into a place. You remember the story of Rip Van Winkle? Great story. He fell asleep one day in a quiet spot, I think on the banks of the Hudson. And while he was there in that place, he didn't wake up for 20 years. When he went to sleep, the sign above his favorite hotel read, King George III, King of England. When he woke up, he was very different. Before he slept, he was a subject to the British crown. And when he woke up, that had been replaced by George Washington, and Rip was now an American citizen. He slept and snored through a revolution. We cannot do that. We are living through all these challenging moments, and we must be alive. We must be ready to pick up whatever it is that God is saying to us, whatever opportunities are arising in those moments. We now have 8 grandchildren. They're all young, not one older than 6. Our daughter, when we went in the new year, wondered why we'd chosen not to stay at the house with them all. And we arrived at breakfast one morning into what pandemonium is only a small descriptor. And we said, Maria, do you now understand why we're at the motel down the road to at least sleep at night? One of the things that I enjoy kids' toys. And playing with children is so important. with our own children and now that level of grandchildren. And I'm always fascinated when you get on the floor and you play the games and you have the latest puzzles and the latest challenges and the latest games. And Grandad's always interested. And I continue to be fascinated by the picture puzzles where children are searching for animals or objects. But you have to know what you're looking for to find it. Now, I find that very, very helpful. You see, the eye is an instrument. The vision is the gift. And God is calling us not only to see, but to catch the vision which he is giving to us. Yes, we see through our own eyes, we see through our own perception, but the vision is his gift to us. We must be alert on many fronts, to and from new opportunities when they arise, to take up responsibilities when they're given, to discover new ways of working together. We must be awake and alert if we're going to take up those things. Then thirdly, the danger that lies in the journey. Now, Luke's account of the transfiguration is not just up on the mount, it's when they come back from the mountain. And I want to draw your attention to that for just a moment. The translation of that experience is something that's important. It shows the failure of the disciples. Raphael, one of the great, great painters of history, the Italian that was only 37 when he died, whose last painting was the Transfiguration, incomplete when he died. In that painting, there's a lovely picture of Jesus, as you would expect in the paintings of Italy that are adorning the Vatican and elsewhere to this day, with all the glory that belongs to that. And yet at the bottom, on the same canvas, is a picture of this account of the failure of the disciples to help a boy in trouble. And I think Raphael, who really would belong to a very different world, is trying to communicate something very important, that there is a connection between the two. And I want a connection between the two. I don't simply want to be a glorified Christian social worker. I don't want to be somebody who is simply engaging week by week and being able to say, well, we've made a difference this week. Neither do I want to be so pious as I think everything is about glory and suddenly closing my eyes, lifting my hands to heaven and living in another world when in fact there is so much pain out there. I want to at least take Raphael's painting seriously, to make a connection between the two. The disciples failed miserably in their efforts to bring healing and wholeness to a child. They failed to bring reconciliation and peace to an anguished father and what Luke alone describes as his only son. I suppose the question is, did the disciples fail to grasp just who Jesus is? Had they lost the fact that time and time again, the power that was his, he was giving to them? He had already started to send them out to minister in his name. If Peter had any doubts about whether Jesus was the Messiah or not, then the mountainside would help to dispel such feelings. Some years ago, a minister received a letter from a young mother. She had had to move house because she received government support for the house that she was living in. And what happened to her when she moved to a new subdivision of the city? She wrote these words: "We tried everything we could think of to make this place something other than a real estate development. We tried recreation, community picnics, and organized dances. We formed a women's club, we held bridge parties, we started a gardening group. We had a parents' association, an evening discussions group. We tried everything, but it was only when the Christian church came that we realized we could be a community." And one of the gifts that we have is embedded in this Christian faith that is ours. that has given purpose and wholeness and helps people to see that it's not just about living together, it's about living together creatively and meaningfully and discovering what the meaning of life is really all about. Mountaintop experiences help us to face the challenges. Fred Craddock, great teacher on preaching, tells the story about the young minister in the seminary that he had taught. He was newly graduated, left from college. He was serving his very first church. He received a call from an older church member, a senior person, saying that there's a woman who is a member of the congregation who is very weak. She can hardly get out of bed, and she needs prayer. All the way to the hospital, the young minister was turning it over in his mind. What will I say? What will I do? How will I pray? He arrived there at the hospital, went into a room, and they shared an uncomfortable few minutes. He knew the question was coming. So he preempted it. He said, "Would you like me to pray?" She said, "Of course, that's why I've asked you to come." He realized he was in one of those helpful pastoral contexts, and so better to do what he'd been asked to do. And so he said, "What would you like me to pray about?" She said, "Well, I want you to ask God to make me strong." Haltingly, he fumbled over his words, and at the end of his prayer, the patient said, "Amen," and got out of bed. Now, the young minister was in a state. In a stupor, he stumbled to the stairwell. He walked down 5 floors of stairs, got into his car, shut the door, closed his eyes and said, "No, you never do that to me again." And sometimes we have to be surprised at what is possible, at what is achievable, at what might just happen if on the one hand we were able to take this glorious vision of what it means to belong in Christ and take with the other hand the needs of a broken and damaged community and society. At the beginning of a new year, we want to see our life and work in a new context. We want to see the possibilities. And we want to see what is beyond our imagining. And we want to be on that mountainside and see the one who is transfigured. And as he is changed, so we too will be changed. Let's begin this year on the mountainside with fresh enthusiasm to face whatever the challenges are when we come down from that mountain. And may the glory belong to Christ.